This meeting is now being recorded.
Okay, and I'll pass things off to Sumi Mehta.
Hi, hello everyone, and thank you for joining here today. I just wanted to give a very brief overview as we get started here before turning it over to my team to get into some of the more detailed information here that we're going to be discussing. Can we get the next slide up, please? We're really here. Here, just give me the mouse. Yeah. Hold on for just a second, please, while we get these. Okay. So I think as many people know, I mean, we're really, we've seen a lot of progress over the past several years, lots of momentum in terms of growth of the clean cooking market. We've seen through our results report, for example, that the number of households adopting clean cooking technologies each year continues to increase, and this is both on the efficient side as well as those that are clean and efficient. But really, as we do this, we really need to now start moving beyond our estimates of distribution to really get a better sense of adoption. And I think as many of you will recall, our goal here at the Global Alliance, for example, is 100 million households adopting clean and efficient cooking solutions. So really, as we do this, we're thinking over our phases. We're really interested in increasing, of course, the quantity and performance of stoves and fuels as we move forward, but then also being able to better track really the households adopting so that we have a better sense of how we can estimate the impacts that everybody is interested in seeing at the end of the day, whether these are impacts on health, climate, environment, livelihoods, or just general overall health of the households. So in order to start moving this aspect of our work forward, we convened a workshop in Peru with a couple of different objectives. The first day was really spent on having everyone get together to share progress on the drivers and determinants of adoption within the clean cooking sector. And really, again, we're trying to focus in more now on some of the more recent studies that have been conducted. We had a very nice opportunity also to highlight the work that was published in a recent Journal of Health Communication special issue, which really focused on behavior change communication within our sector to really get a better sense of kind of what are really the latest evidence in terms of what we know and what we're starting to know from new projects and initiatives on really adoption of clean cooking. And then we also had a great opportunity from PAHO to hear about the work that's being done to ensure the health benefits of scaling up clean cooking related to the WHO's indoor air quality guidelines. And then the second day, which is really going to be the major focus of the webinar today, was really focused on really intensive breakout sessions where people came together to really try to work towards characterizing adoption. What do we all mean when we say adoption? Because, of course, the term has not had a really precise definition so far. And then as we think about what we mean by this, how can we develop a framework to better characterize adoption, including aspects of strategies that we need to promote adoption, what types of indicators we might want to use to estimate adoption, and then related to that, what are the measures that we can use for these indicators, and what tools will be really available in a more pragmatic sense, depending on whether you're an implementer or a researcher or a program developer. What types of tools do people really need to consider in order to really get a better sense of adoption? So there was also then a lot of discussion about really thinking about as we then build on this, of course, the next step, and not something that we focused on in great detail at the workshop, but of course our eyes on the prize at the end of the day is to really think about then how we connect this with approaches to evaluating the associated benefits. And so it was really very thought-provoking and intense workshop, lots of things to talk about and think about. We had a pretty balanced group of participants with around 75 clean cooking stakeholders from a range of implementing agencies, carbon project developers, government ministries, NGOs, international organizations, evaluators, and of course those from the research and academia communities. We also had a range of countries represented. As you can imagine, it was heavily weighted towards the Latin American region, but we also had participation from people working in France, in India, in Switzerland, as well as in the U.S. and in the U.K. And really had a very good discussion about how we think about integrating the enabling environment with the end users. You know, how do we think about how policy drivers, standards, policy, and everything linked together with quality assurance in order to ensure adoption. And there was also a lot of discussion, of course, about the importance of integrating women throughout the value chain. Although there was also surprisingly quite a bit of acknowledgement at the workshop about really the need for ensuring kind of what you might call a welcoming soil for the individual households and users at the community level itself. So, you know, focus not just on the individuals and the households, but also what would be the drivers at the community level. And so I think with that very brief overview, I will turn it over to our colleague here, Praveen Kumar, who's here with us for the summer, you know, on loan from Washington State University in St. Louis. He is going to give a quick overview of some of the highlights from the different panel presentations that we discussed before we turn it over to our M&E officer here to give us more detail about the breakout sessions.
Thanks, Omi, and welcome all for this webinar. So over the next few slides, we'll be discussing some of the brief overview that we had in the panel and the associated presentations. Identification and understanding of the key attributes of adoption were quite central to almost all of these presentations and these panels. For example, the first panel presented results of the Swiss TPH and UPSH Peru's adoption study, and using a socio-ecological model and behavior economic model, this study identified key attributes which influence adoption of clean and safe cooking devices. A key point that emerged from this study and from this panel is that the enablers and barriers are quite context-specific and dynamic, and that's why the study advocated for the use of systems thinking in this sector. Moving to the panel 2, this panel emphasized on the role of behavior change and explored the behavior change strategies which can foster increased adoption. The panelists presented their research findings, and as Somi mentioned, that these findings have already been published in a special supplement of Journal of Health Communication. Some of these findings, for example, in presentation 1, the presenter mentioned the stove stacking issue and the insufficiency of knowledge in handling stoves as critical issues, while in presentation 3, the presenter talked about the role of social marketing strategies and social marketing campaigns which enhanced adoption of clean cook stoves in India, while presentation 2 echoed the importance of the role of behavior change techniques in clean cooking sector. The last two presentations, presentation 4 and 5, used a convergent study designed to emphasize on using qualitative and quantitative study methods for validation and triangulation of data. The third panel presentation from day 1, the PAHO implementation of indoor air quality guidelines. It essentially reviewed the new WHO indoor air quality guidelines, and using combination of various scenarios of traditional and clean cook stoves, the presenter reviewed implications for the level at which the clean cook stoves should perform, and second, the degree to which the clean cook stoves and that should be adopted and the traditional stove should be displaced to meet the WHO's intermediate and ultimate goals. The fourth panel presentation from day 1 kind of recognized the role of women in fostering adoption for clean cook stoves, and the panelists presented their research findings from multiple geographies. The presentation 1 and 2 emphasized on the importance of training program which can really enhance the access of access and demand for improved cook stoves. In fact, presentation 1 also highlighted the effectiveness of female energy entrepreneurs over the male energy entrepreneurs in not only selling the improved cook stoves, but also in fostering sustained adoption. Presentation 3 brought about some empirical evidence from Uganda and really showed that women with independent sources of income foster adoption and have enhanced capacity in purchasing improved cook stoves. While the last presentation 4 of this panel, talked about the impacts of improved cook stoves on women and deduced that if we incorporate and engage women, say, in the value chain, that increases the likelihood of increased adoption of clean cook stoves. The second day of the workshop witnessed 2 panel presentations. The first panel presented research on models, frameworks, and the behavior change techniques in the water sanitation sector. And the presentation also discussed about some of those potential strategies which can be used as leverage points or can't be used, some of those leverage points in the clean cook stove sector. The second panel of the day 2 presentation talked about the techniques and tools for measuring adoption of stove use panel. For example, presentation 1 highlighted the kind of advocated a portfolio mix of fuel use, stove, and cooking practices for a complete displacement of the traditional stoves, while presentation 2 talked about the new and improved stove use monitoring designs. And the presentation 3 from the Next Leaf Analytics, the presenter discussed about the wireless cook stove sensors to understand and record the stove uses, while presentation 4 kind of highlighted that the stove use and performance and a key combination of these two are key for the maximum household impact. So these were the 6 panels and associated presentations. A detailed post-workshop report is available on this website, and this website also contains all the presentations from these 6 panels. And now I'll hand over to my colleague Liz, and she will walk us through the breakout sessions where we characterize adoption and develop indicators.
Thanks, Praveen. Hi, this is Liz. I just joined the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves in May as the Monitoring and Evaluation Officer, and I joined just in time to attend this workshop, which was a really fantastic introduction to many of you who attended, and especially to listen to all the presentations given by our experts and practitioners out there in the field. So what I'd like to do is go over our breakout sessions that we had on the second day. Each breakout session was themed by a stage in the value chain, and we chose elements of the value chain because of their influence on adoption and as a way to structure the conversation and create different groups to discuss indicators for adoption within each of those different phases of the value chain. So the objectives of the session were to define adoption and develop a practical framework for implementers to use to measure and evaluate the range of potential benefits that can be achieved through adoption of clean cooking solutions. The second objective was to start building consensus around defining key indicators of adoption and appropriate measures. So these definitions were all, that you'll see in the next few slides, were all created in these working sessions by each group. We had started off with a draft working definition, and many of them were updated and improved, which was a great help. And the indicators that you'll see on the slides were also created during those working sessions. And these are what we're considering a very helpful, strong starting point for us to eventually define definition of adoption. The next step is this actual webinar where we'd like to collect your feedback and your discussion on those indicators that we started with in the workshop in Peru. And then there'll be a public consultation period on them that will also help us finalize the indicators for adoption and defining adoption in the end. Okay, so we started off with policy and coverage. I want to go back to the previous slide to show you that we added policy and coverage to the value chain. It's not represented here, but you'll see in this note that we felt it was still a very important influencer. So that is the first step, and then we go into promotion, which is the first stage that we decided to start with and focus on for the workshop. So policy and coverage, the definition that our group came up with, they divided it by policy and coverage distinctly. So policy is the joint implementation by public and private actors to promote, facilitate, frame, install, and sustain the use of clean cooking technologies. And coverage is the extent of access to information and technology options, and or, of course, culturally acceptable and economically viable clean fuels for families to cook with different clean fuels. Some of the key things that were considered key under policy and coverage to adoption that the group came up with on other notes were the inclusion of clean cooking technologies and solutions in multi-year strategic and national development plans, the fact of the importance of public and private partnerships, and having one ministry or one sector or even one person as a champion to lead and drive policy was also considered critical. Some of the indicators I'll highlight that our group came up with would be the increase in the number of funded policies that promote clean cooking solutions. And you'll see across this table, we created this template as a way to structure the conversation. We asked people not only to select some indicators, but to give us some potential metrics that we could use to assess that indicator and determine whether it was a qualitative or quantitative approach or both, and to discuss what scale we would measure that indicator at. And you'll see through here the different possibilities of scale that we could measure this at. Another indicator to highlight is the increase in inclusion of clean cooking policies in annual plans and programs. And also the presence of monitoring and evaluation of those policies and other mechanisms to track and encourage adoption. Okay, I'll move to the next slide. Okay, promotion as the first official stage in the value chain that we use for this workshop. The definition that was created for promotion is the sharing of information and creation of motivation to adopt healthy behaviors in food preparation by generating correct and sustainable demand and use of improved cooking solutions. At the individual and community level, it shows actions to inform, motivate, and raise awareness on clean cooking to generate demand and sustain correct and consistent use. You'll see aspects of this definition that come up later in some themes we have for our discussion. Some things that were considered critical to adoption under the promotion category by our breakout session group was the need to harness or create community norms to maintain the desired behavior. Of course, to identify and offer benefits that are desired by our target audience. And as you can see in the definition, generating awareness, creating motivation for sustained demand and use. So not just sustained supply and access, but the sustained demand was key to this part. Other ways promotion directly contributes to adoption that were highlighted during this session was that promotion should help explain the benefits of adoption and communicate those. And promotion should also be a way of influencing society through laws like consumer protection laws, quality assurance, safety, and again, more emphasis is placed on community norms being established. Those are some highlights from the group discussion. Some of the indicators to highlight are the increase in knowledge level and attitude on clean cooking. This indicator could be broken down by a number of different metrics, or even broken down into different indicators about what kind of knowledge and what kind of attitude we want to see improved or increased in our target audience. And the group here laid out some very nice clear ones about the number of people who are aware of clean cooking, the number of people who can name the benefits of clean cooking. Those are all good examples to start with. And, of course, the increase in stove sales over time is another indicator that was highlighted. And there's a couple indicators. This slide is promotion is a two-slide indicator table. There's a couple indicators here you'll see that have a crossover with policy. So the one on the first slide, sorry about that. The presence of government support and involvement. There's some crossover of policy there as well that we could think about either wording a different way to make it clear, or to actually choose which kind of value chain stage it belongs under. And the same for the presence of or the increase in educational institutions focusing on clean cooking solutions, and the emphasis on establishing public institutions that support quality assurance and testing and safety. Those kind of cross over between promotion indicators and the policy indicators. But that would be helpful in the discussion to look at that more closely. Another indicator here I want to highlight before moving on to distribution and uptake is the presence of public-private partnerships that promote change. There are a lot of nice metrics that were laid out here as a starting point to assess that indicator, with the integration of safe cooking messages and education into ongoing programs, and a number of promoters that are out there incorporating user perspectives in their promotion messaging. I'll move on to distribution and uptake. Okay, the definition of distribution and uptake that was created by our group. We also had divided this into two distinct sections. The distribution is the mechanism for stove access. And we clarified we want stoves here to be known as stoves that meet the needs of the users with continuous availability, access to parts, and access to repair services. And uptake is the presence of a functional stove in a household. But for the purpose of this discussion around indicators for distribution and uptake, we want to make it clear not necessarily stoves in use. At this stage, we just want to make sure there are acceptable stoves that are accessible and in households. At this point, there's really no indication of how the stove arrived in the household, and it may include multiple stoves. So we use that as our frame for how to define the indicators for distribution uptake. So the theme of this group, again, this is a two-slide table of indicators. I'll just show you the next slide. You can see the number that were created here. So generally, this is much more quantitative in terms of counting the number of repair services, vendors, all of those we wanted to sex aggregate so we could also calculate how many repair vendors and sellers were women, the number of people who know where to get their stove repaired, the people who know where to buy their stove. You'll see some crossover with those kinds of indicators in promotion as well, and the number of users who agreed the stoves meet their needs. We wanted to factor in user acceptance. You'll see these are also about the number of stove sales per vendor, per provider. We wanted to sex aggregate that as well, so we could see stove sales sold by women-led businesses or by women sales agents. And, of course, the presence of stove financing options. This is all about the type of access and distribution coverage that our projects or our programs are achieving. Okay, I'll move to the next value chain phase, which is intensity of use. Okay, this is a nice, simple, clean definition. For intensity of use, the definition is the degree to which clean stoves and fuels have displaced traditional stoves for household cooking purposes. You'll see in the discussion, displacement of traditional stoves and fuels was a pretty key theme. And if you review the presentations themselves on the website, or if you attended, you'll remember and see that that was a really critical outcome from some of the studies that we were able to listen to. So indicators for intensity of use. There was two for us to start with. The increase in clean stoves displacing traditional stoves. And this could be measured by minutes per day that each stove is being used, or the days per week the stove is being used. This could also be out of the total number of cooking events or cooking hours, how many of those are done on the clean cooking technology or solution package of the stove and the fuel. And the increase in the purchase of clean fuels, tracking the changes in fuel purchase, and even different types of household income spending trends could be used to get a closer picture or a clearer picture of the intensity of use of our clean cooking solutions. Okay, and the last stage of the value chain that influences adoption is sustained adoption. And I think both these last two groups, intensity of use and sustained adoption, had very robust or very rigorous conversations. They really opened up a lot of good themes for us to think about, and we have notes from those. Some of the things that came out of the discussion on sustained adoption that are critical to defining sustained adoption is the willingness to continue and invest in the stove and the fuel, the time period that the stove and fuel are used. Some other things, pardon me, is the function of daily use and intensity of use in different contexts, community, culture, institutional, and how those cultural contexts influence the intensity of use over time and how much that clean cooking technology is being considered a norm in the household versus just an extra or a side technology to their primary stove. And sustained adoption should show that users do not want to go back to use their traditional stoves. That was another theme that came out of the discussion, that it would be useful to try and measure the lack of willingness to return to the traditional stove as an indicator of what sustained adoption would be. So on the table of indicators, what we came up with would be the increase or the presence of the willingness to have, maintain, or pay for a clean cook stove and fuel. This was considered a pretty critical part of sustained adoption. Increasing in the demand for maintenance and replacement of the clean cook stove, as well as increase in the local support for a clean cook stove. So we want to make sure parts were always available and that experts and repair staff or services would be available as well. And awareness of benefits of clean cooking technologies was considered an important aspect of sustaining adoption. And as I said earlier, the time period over which a clean cooking solution is being used. Okay, so I'd like to go over some higher level themes that were covered during the breakout sessions, from the presentations themselves, from the discussion after the presentations. So the next two slides cover some themes that we consider as a group enabling factors to characterizing adoption, and then also defining factors that might be important to consider for the definition of adoption. And sometimes it's difficult to separate them. So you see I have a list here of enabling factors, and I want to get into right after that the defining factors for adoption, for characterizing adoption. They are difficult to separate because sometimes some of these enabling factors defining adoption might be considered a moot point if some of these issues on this slide aren't first addressed. And then some defining factors of adoption are also difficult because they could be considered more of an enabling factor as well. So these two slides could be really where we'd all like to get some discussion or feedback or questions from the group, from all of you attending this webinar. And we'll use this feedback to help us push forward our ability to characterize adoption and then define it, and finalize the indicators that you saw on the last few slides. So one of the enabling factors is our behavior change communication approaches. Are we using positive or negative approaches? The same examples that are used in the water and sanitation and health sector don't actually have a parallel we can apply to in this sector. And we want to increase the demand, or really we want to actually create aspirational products. We want products that people want and are demanding rather than pushing products on our target audiences. Another enabling factor to adoption is we really do need to engage the next generation of stove users. We have to actively engage the youth and education sector. That came out of the workshop as something that could enable adoption. Equity is still a key consideration that we need to keep in mind when we're characterizing and defining adoption and when we're trying to measure it. And user acceptance, it's not really a wise use of time to invest a lot of our efforts into behavior change communication strategies and market interventions to increase adoption when we have not established user acceptance of the stoves yet. We do have to make sure the stoves are working, they're high quality, and our target audience not only likes them, but feels they do the job for them. And I know everyone here knows that, but it's an important thing to keep in mind before moving forward that user acceptance needs to be the starting point for adoption. And willingness to pay. We got into a lot of really interesting discussions about willingness to pay during the workshop, and I think the best question that was asked from an audience member summarizes those back and forth comments and questions and answers that were really interesting was, do people pay for something and sustain it because they see returns, or do they sustain it because they paid for it? We definitely spent a good amount of time grappling with that question, and it's an important thing to insert into our conversation about defining adoption or even these enabling steps towards achieving adoption. This is one where I could see it going in a definition conversation or in the enabling strategies. And the role of women. We had a lot of good presentations on the success generated by empowerment trainings, by encouraging gender-based business plans and involving women in testing and selling and maintaining clean cooking solutions. Those are found to be key to adoption. Praveen highlighted a couple of these, that women were outselling men, and men were doing a good job selling as well, but the fact that women were bringing in an extra layer of success, just another key enabling factor to achieve adoption that we need to consider before for the definition of adoption. And the next slide that, again, this is to set up our discussion. Some defining factors. So these are things to put in the category of what will be useful for us to think about defining adoption is a strong theme came up in several presentations, is that adoption is a process, and it reinforces the value, which reinforces the value in using a definitional framework based on the value chain that we did for the breakout sessions in order to kind of structure our conversation and our thoughts around listing out the indicators for adoption. And clearly the theme of the workshop in Peru was beyond distribution. So this theme that came up in the presentations, adoption as a process, kind of echoed the fact that increased distribution and access to clean cooking solutions is not enough. So that was validating, and that came up so often that I thought it was really important to add to what we would consider for defining adoption. Intensity or usage level is another area we should think about when defining adoption. We could base this definition on a specific usage level. For example, the number of hours out of the total cooking hours the clean cook stove is used could be included in the definition. Same for stove stacking or displacement of traditional stoves. We could consider the degree to which a traditional stove is displaced in the definition of adoption. This came up as stove displacement came up as very crucial to generating the impacts needed in the presentations and some of the results of the research studies that were shared with us. So it's another factor added to this list of things we should consider for our definition. And then lastly, we really, as a field, as a sector, should try to distinguish or define adoption from sustained adoption. A lot of times the word adoption was used as initial uptake, but it was also used as sustained adoption. So it was used to describe first-time use or just use in general, but it was also used by others to describe adoption over time at the right level of use that generates impacts. So adoption could be useful, defined as the degree to which a clean cook stove is considered a norm in the household. And sustained adoption could be based on a more strict level of displacement of traditional stoves or a higher or more intense usage level. And factoring in some of the other critical issues that were highlighted during the breakout session, like the increased need for repair services or the increased demand for repair and the increase in repurchases of stoves once they have run through their lifespan. Okay, so before we get to, this is where I would like to begin the discussion from the attendees that are joining the call. And I'm going to hand it over to Sumi. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz, for that very good kind of concise summary of what was a lot of intensive discussion over that second day. We actually have several people on the line here who were very instrumental to making this workshop a success. And so we would like to take this time maybe first to invite a few comments and thoughts from some of the people who were there with us before opening up to the broader discussion, just to maybe start up a couple of more kind of questions related to the adoption that we want to consider. So I know we have on the line Helen Pitak from USAID, Ilse Ruiz from UNAM, Joshua Rosenthal, perhaps Anita Shankar from Hopkins, and then I think several others. It's not totally easy for me to see the list of people, but I think what we're going to do is we'll perhaps unmute you one by one, and maybe even Stella. Can I have the, let me see if I can get the mouse really quickly so we can scroll down and see who else is here. But maybe, and Richard Grinnell as well, our market manager for the region. If I could maybe first invite Ilse Ruiz to maybe make a couple of comments. Let me just double check which one is her name so that we can unmute her. Just a second. This one? Yeah. Okay. Just a second. So Ilse. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Ilse, can you hear us?
Yes, Sumi?
We should be able to, yeah, we should be able to hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Sumi. I think another aspect that was very important from the seminar was just in the process of it to understand that working on a definition or having a final definition of adoption and the adoption process was hard to have just in 1 or 2 or a couple of hours, and that we needed to continue these efforts. I think it was a very interesting exercise. We were able to see different perspectives. One, for example, from Latin America, we talk a lot about the cooking practices, the stove niches, and the end uses. So that's one of the elements that the framework that we are using in terms of understanding adoption and quantifying the different stages: acceptance, initial use, sustained use, or combined use, or abandoning a stove, in terms not only of numbers for uses, the number of meals or the number of days that the stove is used or not used, but also in terms of what are the tasks, the cooking task, or the end uses that the stoves are being used for. Because at the end, having a number, just a number, is not sufficient to have the information of for what the stoves are being used. So, for example, another issue that came up was when we have these assessments, usually of adoption, we have a question that comes up very often in the questionnaires of what is your primary stove and what is the secondary stove. And after a little bit, we have a very quick exchange in the seminar. We were looking back at this question, and it's very difficult to say which one is the primary. For example, for some of us, even though we use very little a microwave in our daily lives, it is still a key part of our cooking task, even though in terms of the number of uses, it's not the main one. So one thing that we've been studying in Mexico and finding out is that it's important to see not only the number of uses, but classifying all the cooking tasks and see what are the main tasks in terms of the importance that they have for tradition, but also for the ones that are the cooking tasks that have the longer frequency, for example, that are used always, even though they are not daily. So some tasks like tortilla making are done every other day, or some other task that is used for tortilla is done once a week. Even though it's once a week, so it would be 1 out of 7 in terms of number of uses, it's done always. So we look at also those aspects, and also the some dimensions of usage that makes it tricky to quantify it, like the seasonal patterns. Some stoves are used when in the dry season, for example, wood stoves, and when that's not the best option, then people go back to gas. So another key point was looking at combined metrics, not only usage, but also stacking. So how to combine metrics to have the input of identifying what tasks are the ones that are that stay, or the residual use that stay in the open fires. And looking at this combination is that we can understand or measure our success in adoption. So the open file can still be used for a couple of tasks, but if these tasks are done outside of the house or if they don't imply exposure, even though they are done daily, that could be probably not as bad as we think, even though it's one use daily. So we were looking at these details, and we also were concluding that it is important to have more people involved in the discussion that have a lot of experience in adoption and to learn from the different regions. So Latin America has something to contribute, but I'm sure other regions also.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ilse, and also I think we all need to thank Ilse for those of you who may not be less aware for really a lot of the thought leadership in terms of really thinking about stove stacking and how you characterize it and how you measure it has really come from the San Omar's group. So we're very much appreciate your continued contributions in this area. Maybe now I think I would like to, we're going to go into this one moment. A few of you, if you're here, if you can just send a chat to let us know kind of who you are, that would be very helpful because we can't always identify by the phone numbers when you're calling in exactly who you are. So maybe next, I think I would like to invite Helen Pitak from USAID to also perhaps provide some comment. Just a second, please. Helen, we should be able to hear you now.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Sumi. And Ilse, your comments were very well placed. I thought that was a very appropriate comment. Something that I took away from this meeting in Peru was that as we started to describe what these indicators might look like, the list of indicators could be really quite enormous and cover a truly very wide variety of ground. So perhaps one of the takeaway messages I had was that we needed to think about what the objectives were of coming up with this collection of key performance indicators. What do we really want to use that information for? And once we know what we would use the information for, what are the key indicators that we need in order to address those questions? And I actually think that needs to be a collective effort. There's a lot of different perspectives in the cook stove space, and I feel like it would be useful to be able to canvass people's opinion about what those key performance indicators are, and I don't know if the Global Alliance has that in mind for the near future. But as we try to build this key subset of indicators, I think getting input from the larger group will be really important. So Sumi, I'll turn that back over to you. Maybe you could comment a little bit on what you think about the process that the Global Alliance will be taking in the near future.
Yeah, and Helen, if you don't mind, if we can hold that until the next steps, because we'll be talking about that after we kind of have the discussion for people in terms of the public comment period and getting a broader group of stakeholders to also provide comments. Because just in brief, I think that this was a great opportunity to convene a lot of people, and particularly a lot of the thought leadership that's gone on within the Latin America region. But we would like to also have broader feedback from the more global community, and so we are going to be having a public comment period that's focused on this more broadly and really plan to finalize, the approach when we're all together in Ghana at the forum at the end of the year. So now I'm going to try to see whether I can turn it over to Richard, who is our market manager, but unfortunately, Richard, we only have your the name, that's the name of your computer one, so I know you said you're number 29, so I think that we need to figure out which one of these phone numbers is you. I think what I'll do is maybe quickly, I think the Skype ones are usually the 661. If you can, maybe we'll go to Josh Rosenthal first while we figure out where Richard is. Just a second, please. And apologies again, the system is always a little bit clunky in terms of trying to do this. Josh, can you see whether we can hear you now, please?
This is Josh. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, very good. Well, I wanted to congratulate all the organizers for a really terrific meeting. And one of the things I found really, really helpful was the broad integration and collection of not only academic thought leaders, if you will, but an extensive group of private sector participants that were both distributors and commercial organizations as well. And so I thought it was a very productive discussion and enabling people to see different points of view in what's a really complicated field. Along those lines, I thought one of the most interesting challenges for this field, and I think that Helen alluded to it as well in terms of how the end use of these indicators, where we intend to go with it, and one important concept I think to disentangle is whether or not the indicators and the metrics are oriented toward understanding the enabling factors and barriers, or they're oriented toward measuring success. Because they are in the current list combined and mixed in a number of ways, and that may be fine. I just think it's important to be clear about that in whatever final form they take. But for example, there were a number of points, I think, in the intensity of use where they're talking about increase in supply of expertise and accessibility for manufacturers, repair people, etc. That's a really important enabling factor, but it may not. Is it a metric of success for a program per se? So just an example, but I thought it was really quite interesting. There's another rather specific point that I had, and that was in one of the early observations under looking at frameworks in Jay Graham's presentation of WASH, and whether or not shaming had a parallel in this field. And I'd like to challenge the notion that shaming, or perhaps the flip side, status, is not important. And because we heard other speakers refer to the importance of a clean home, and how, black on your walls can become a mark of lower status in an environment where there is social change moving actively. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Josh. That's helpful. And I think it is really interesting to bring up this point again, because there was quite a bit of discussion about whether it's the carrot or the stick in terms of really trying to promote, particularly when you're thinking about community motivators, thinking about this issue of shaming. Could you maybe, Josh, before we move to the next comment, if you could maybe just spend 2 minutes telling everybody a little bit about the Implementation Science Network, which I think is a very related activity that's ongoing through your leadership at NIH, and I think is quite relevant, particularly as you say, in terms of an effort that's more focused on, how do we think about this in terms of ensuring the benefits.
Sure. Well, we have recently formed and are still developing a network of experts and implementers with a limited size, and this is here at the NIH, based here at the NIH, and we have participation by USAID, Helen Pitek specifically, and her Traction group, and others from the Alliance, and several institutes here at the NIH in helping organize and put together a broad sort of approach to the field of adoption and use at the center of that focus. How can we ensure that the science of clean cooking, it really addresses health benefits in the end? And what we're interested in doing is drawing on experiences as well as theories of behavior change, implementation science, and developing a sort of synthetic view of where the field has gone and where it needs to go that will have practical outcomes. So we look really very much to the outcomes of this meeting and others like it to help us have some important components to where it will go. But ultimately, we aim to develop both academic level advice that's practical in the context of research, and then a set of understandings at both global and local levels that will help support implementation programs for policymakers and those in the private sector.
Okay, thank you very much, Josh. And maybe now we can move and switch gears a little bit to talk about the feedback and the implications, particularly for the implementers who are on the more market side of things. And so I'm now going to attempt to unmute Richard Grinnell, but there are two numbers here. Let's see which one will actually work. I see two numbers from Guatemala, so Richard, I hope one of them is going to be you. Can you say something and see if I can hear you now? Okay, now let's try. Now, Richard, you want to say something and see if I can hear you now? Hello?
I think I muted Ilse instead.
Oh, it's okay. See, it's difficult to know which is the number to dial in. Okay, what I'm gonna do now, very riskily, is I'm gonna unmute everybody for a second, and then perhaps if Richard, if you can speak up, we can see which one is flashing, and then we can mute the rest. Just a minute, please.
All guests have been unmuted.
Okay. Okay, Richard? Oh. Is this you? Okay, just a second then. So you're 70. Okay, hold on for just a second now, guys.
All guests have been muted.
Oops.
I'm no longer muted now.
No, now I can hear you. Thank you. Wonderful. Sorry, we were just, Skype gives the fake phone numbers, so it's not always easy to find.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, good morning. And again, I wanted to echo on what people have said. I think the workshop was great. I think there was a lot of good information that came from it. And so my comments going into, because I know we have a short amount of time here, one of the main takeaways that I had was that all this wonderful information needs to get in a relatively short period of time down to the implementers, to the program implementers that are trying to get stoves out there and have them being adopted. But the other part that I wanted to mention was where is the failure to adopt coming from? There's two sides to that. One is on the implementation side. It could be the program that is having an issue with the adoption. Or do they have spare parts? Do they have services? Are they a long-term program, or is it a very one-time come through the community, implement stoves, and move on to the next one? And there is no backup for that program in the long term. Also, the access to stoves for family members who are marrying and forming their own household when they move out. Do they have access to the technologies that they are enjoying at home with their parents? And so all these are issues about long-term usage, being able to replace when it wears out, or I need a new one for a new member of the family. The other part of it is on the stacking. I just had a quite interesting visit to Honduras, and I went to a peri-urban area where they were implementing the government's stove program, giving out the EnviroFit plancha stove. And when I went into these households, they had an electric stove, they had kerosene stoves, and they had other appliances. There were microwaves in some of them, and even rice makers, which was quite nice. But they were moving from electricity back to firewood because electricity is more expensive to run than the plancha stove using firewood. So it was interesting to see. It's not that the technology does not work and they did not use it. It was more on the economy side. I know it happens here in Guatemala quite a bit where they move away from propane if the price of propane goes up significantly. and they move away from the cleaner technology and back down the ladder of energy ladder, if you may. Again, there was the stacking issue that Ilse mentioned during the seminar. It's extremely important because even though they did have the plancha stove and it was working very well in the household there in Honduras, they were still using the kerosene stove for certain items, you know. So that means that the technologies that we're putting in don't necessarily cover all the needs the family has for cooking or for heating the household or for heating water for bathing, etc. So all that we need to keep in mind on the implementation side. When we design technologies, it covers all like they do in Colombia, where they have a huge stove that does multitask, or do we have several stoves that fulfill specific needs? So those would be my comments on the implementer side, market side.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that. So now I think I would like to open it up. Perhaps the easiest thing to do is for those of you who would like to make comments, if you could just put your questions initially into a chat or let us know who you are so that we can then unmute you so that you can also join the discussion. I think that would be very, very helpful. And there are several others I know who are on the phone who are there, and so we would love to welcome your thoughts as well in terms of what you think. I see in particular Daniel Moisenthal, who led the Peru study team, is here. Daniel, perhaps again I can unmute and you can let me know who you are phone number wise, and then you could maybe also give a few words.
All guests have been unmuted.
Okay, I think I found you.
All guests have been muted.
Okay, Daniel, please go ahead. Daniel? Oh, was that not Daniel?
I think it might be me.
Who is me?
Jane Audrey.
Oh, Jane, thank you. Would you like to comment before or shall I mute you?
No, you caught me by surprise actually, so no, not really.
No, okay, that's fine. I'm sorry. It's very difficult with this system to figure out who wants to chat. Okay. So maybe then what we'll do is why don't we go ahead, if somebody has got something that they would like to raise, can you please go ahead and just write it into the chat box so that we can then take the consideration. In the meantime, maybe I'll go ahead, and there was a question that came up earlier from Sunny Morgan here asking about ethanol gel fuel in particular, and I would say that of course the Alliance considers ethanol a clean fuel, and in fact we have several different studies and evaluations that are ongoing which are focused on ethanol. So happy to take that up with you offline if you're interested to hear more details about that. Other questions or comments that we have from the audience, or comments that you would like to make? I'm going to just wait for a moment in case people are typing away. Okay, so I guess this question is coming from Guatemala about the studies on ethanol. I would be happy to share there are studies on ethanol ongoing, and so we can give you a summary of those studies again offline for people who are interested. One that I can just highlight, for example, is a study in Nigeria that's looking at the role of adopting ethanol during pregnancy and its impact on birth outcomes in children, on whether it affects their low birth weight, for example. But there are others, so we can talk about that separately offline. Daniel, I think now I have found you, and I should be able to hopefully unmute you, and it would be wonderful to hear your feedback, particularly related to the work that you've been working on with colleagues at Cayetano University in Peru. Please go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Sumi. I just joined coming from another meeting, so sorry. I don't know what exactly I should be now reporting back from that work, apart from what we presented. What is your specific question? We are actually now trying to write up the results that we presented.
Yes, and I think, Daniel, maybe it would be just very useful, and I know that we're going to have a separate webinar devoted to the adoption study, but just in terms of some of the big picture, the discussion that we had at the workshop about kind of defining and measuring adoption, just a little bit of insight if you wanted to provide to give flavor from some of the key learnings that you and your group took away from the workshop. And I know particularly you were involved in the kind of characterizing adoption, sustained adoption discussion, so people may be interested in hearing a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, what we really took from the meeting was the issue to get the right stoves to the large masses of people, and that in itself provides a huge challenge. And once we reach the people at scale, we have seen that this shift from moving away from a traditional stove to clean energy provides the biggest obstacles. So the take-home message from the presentation on how to change from tier 1 to tier 3 stove and looking at that in an intermediate phase, that is basically the challenge that we think we need to address. And the next big challenge then is to achieve sustained use of those devices, and for that one we have proposed this specific definition of sustained adoption, for which we really think the issue of improving and considering the willingness to pay and the willingness to invest in the replacement and the operation and maintenance is key to consider. So in measuring basically the success of the programs, the pure take on of adoption and use we think is not sufficient, and the sustained adoption, considering use and investment into clean cooking beyond the lifetime of the stove needs to be considered. And we are basically trying to address that in these 3 different sites where we conducted this study, and use that for our next studies to evaluate the outcomes of the different programs that we are working with.
Okay. Thank you very much, Daniel, and I think that was really helpful, and I know that people should really look forward to hearing more about your study, and in particular, I think some of the issues related to the kind of the community and policy determinants of adoption, as well as the influence in terms of maybe, this issue as you raised about really what we need to do to better understand the kind of the purchase of the next better stove beyond kind of the first improvement in technology. So now we do have a question from Josh Rosenthal here saying, is there, I can't read the whole question, just a second. Oops, I see. It's saying, is there value in overlap definitions across this value chain, policy, promotion, distribution, etc.? And I think the short answer is, I think absolutely yes. There's so many different ways to kind of cut this that there is necessarily going to be some overlap, and at some point we can figure out how best to kind of streamline across the overall set of indicators, but there certainly has to be overlap at this moment here. Now, Helen has asked a question saying, Richard described some of the logistical factors that are crucial to adoption: parts, services, long-term view to the market, and certainly these are critical. How can we aggregate adoption studies when these elements are not present? Perhaps there are logistical constraints that are affecting, and this could be perhaps the quote-unquote elephant in the room for adoption. And I think that this is without a doubt the case, and Richard raises a very important point in terms of really, and I think that this is where I think some of the policy drivers and some of the really community-level factors also need to be carefully considered, particularly as we think about not only some of the failures that may have occurred in the past, but also when we consider how to think about replicating the scale up from one place to another to make sure that those enabling factors that are really so critical and in some cases essential for success are really adequately dealt with. Other questions, comments that we can from the audience? Maybe while we're waiting for some more people to proceed, I mean, I think it's also really essential to underscore what Richard was saying, that it's really important that we have, from our implementer community really coming on board to think about this as soon as possible so that it can kind of influence the way that maybe that shape a little bit of the thinking about how we think about our measurement of adoption. And really, that's why I think it's so important to think about making sure that the tools that we have available are not just tools that can be used within academic or research evaluation settings, but really, practical ways of doing this on the ground, so that people don't have to be overly burdened with the ability to do this. Of course, there's always a place for the more detailed, in-depth, deeper dive studies within the research and academic context, but we really need to have approaches that are very practical for people in order to really look at this more broadly and in a feasible manner. Other questions, comments? Okay. So with that, here's another one. Okay, Helen says, Ilse raises another important point about classifying cooking tasks. Is this approach incorporated into some of the current studies? Is there data to share? So I think that this is a very important point, and I would say it's even a little bit more broadly than classifying cooking tasks. We've noticed that it's really the broader group of energy tasks that we need to think about, particularly with respect to heating and lighting, for example, because if you have situations where the traditional stove is meeting those needs, then you also have to consider how that is being addressed. I think we do have some broad-scale data available that WHO has been collecting, for example, in terms of the main energy that's being used for cooking versus lighting versus heating. It is something that I think that the studies, particularly in terms of the stove stacking and energy stacking, that the studies do try to address this in depth. But I think that, again, this is the kind of thing that's going to be extremely context-specific that needs to be kept in mind. So I think that this is something that we need to just keep on our radar moving forward. Other questions or comments? While I wait, we did have some questions that were emailed to us that maybe I can also kind of try to raise. One, just clarifying whether the adoption of clean cooking should be inclusive of the entire value chain, starting from stove availability, maintenance, logistics, and home use, or should there be a greater focus on the end user? And I think that the big picture answer to that is that, of course, we're most interested in what's happening at the end user level, but that in order to do that, you really have to look across the value chain to see how you actually get to that point. Other questions or comments before we move on? I'm going to wait another moment here and just also emphasize that we realize that there's also a real need, and just again going back to this issue of technology performance and standards, that we really have to think very carefully about the extent to which the adoption may be characterized differently depending on the type of technology that's being scaled up, and this is going to be a key consideration also if we think about in terms of the extent to which people may be more or willing to adopt technologies that are somewhat similar or very different in terms of their characteristics and benefits from what they have been using traditionally. So that's something that we should really emphasize in terms of, not just thinking of adoption of clean cooking writ large, but really how this differs by technology performance. Okay, so if there are no more questions at the moment, I'll move ahead, and of course feel free to continue and put in your questions on the chat if you have additional ones. But maybe just to give people a quick snapshot now of where we are, you can see that the workshop summary is now available online. You can actually look at all of the presentations from the workshop, from these breakout sessions, as well as the detailed meeting report. It's all available. And we're now very pleased to open up really what we might call a public comment period to kind of give feedback on what we have so far in terms of the information from these breakout sessions. So really from now until about mid-July, would welcome everybody's feedback on the different summary of the indicators and measures that you can see from the breakout sessions. And of course, we know that there are certain gaps and things there that need to be filled. Really looking forward to filling those in. And that we will then take some time this summer to incorporate the feedback, try to find ways of filling in any really priority gaps that we see that are still missing. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, we know that we had good representation at the workshop, but of course it was by no means everyone. And so we will then also get additional feedback with assistance from our market managers, from our focus countries, would welcome feedback from our other partners who have thought a lot about this as well. And in particular, I would just like to note GIZ, for example, has been doing a lot of thinking on this over time, both at the secretariat level as well as in country. So we would welcome their thoughts in doing this. SEI is another group that comes to mind. So there are many players who have done a lot on this, and we would like to incorporate all of their feedback. And then the idea is really to then reconvene and finalize the indicators at the Cookstone Forum in Ghana, so that we can have kind of then the full set of indicators that we need, as well as the approaches that we need, and some of the key simple measures that we can use there. And again, this is going to be kind of the higher level, some more simplistic ways of doing this, as well as some suggestions for the more deeper in-depth assessments that we have. Questions, comments? Okay. So then I think with that would really Josh says sounds like a great plan. Thanks, Josh. So with that, I would really like to, again, I think most importantly, thank all of the organizers and participants of the workshop in Peru. It was really, I cannot tell you what, really thought-provoking and very committed group of people that we had. Some of them I know are kind of silently listening on the phone, but here you can see many of them pictured in our workshop, a photograph here. But really want to thank everybody for the enthusiasm and really generosity of intellectual contribution that you've given to this very important topic. And we really look forward to moving forward with this in a very careful but also pragmatic way. So thanks, everyone. And with that, look forward to hearing people's comments over the next 6 weeks or so and suggestions so that we can continue to refine our approach.